My name is Diane Caldwell. I am 39 years old. My mother-in-law had a key to my home. She used it 4 times a week. She called me nobody. She coached my husband on what to say during our arguments, from a voice memo, 18 minutes long. 3 years after my divorce, she sat across my desk and signed the papers to sell the Hartley family home. She had no one else to call. Has someone ever tried to make you feel like nobody? Comment yes or no. This story is for you. It was a Tuesday in November, 11 in the morning, and the street outside was the color of old pewter. I had walked back from June's Cafe on Center Street with a coffee going cold in my hand, and leaves catching against my boots, and I could smell the rain coming the way you can in New England when the air shifts before the first drop falls. June had handed me the coffee without my asking, the way she always did. She was the only person in Millbrook who did that. I climbed the porch steps. The front door was unlocked. I had locked it when I left. I turned the handle and opened it and heard, from the back of the house, the sound of someone in my kitchen, a drawer closing, the particular soft sound of ceramic on ceramic, someone setting a lid on a pot. I stood in the hallway. The house smelled of chicken broth and thyme, a smell I associate now with the particular sensation of something in my chest going still. Eleanor Hartley was at my stove. She was 66 years old, with fair skin and white blonde hair set in the way she always set it when she left the house, neat and permanent, as though the day had been planned. She was wearing an apron over her wool cardigan, one of my aprons, the gray one from the hook behind the pantry door. She wore small pearl earrings, the kind that do not move when you turn your head. The good china, the blue and white set Robert and I had received as a wedding gift, was stacked on the counter beside her. The spice drawer was open. The spices were in a different order than I had left them. She turned when she heard me. She smiled. "I made a little soup," she said. "I hope that's all right." I asked her how she had gotten in. She said, "Robert thought it would be nice if I had a key, in case of emergencies." She went back to the soup. The lid went back on the pot, and she adjusted the flame, and she stood there in my kitchen in my apron, as though the question had been answered and the matter was settled. I set my coffee down on the hall table. I did not go into the kitchen. I stood at the edge of the doorway, and I looked at the spice drawer and the china and Eleanor at my stove, and something at the back of my jaw went tight. I picked up my coffee again, and walked upstairs, and sat on the edge of the bed, and listened to the sound of cooking coming up through the floor for 20 minutes. That evening, after dinner, after Eleanor had left and the kitchen was clean in the way Eleanor left kitchens, everything in its place except the places she had changed, I asked Robert about the key. I asked him in the kitchen, at the table quietly, while he was still reading the news on his tablet. He said, "She's my mother. She's not going to steal anything." I said that wasn't the point. He said, "Can we not do this tonight?" Robert was not a cruel man. He called his mother every single day, and he had called her the morning we closed on our Millbrook house before he called his own firm. I was learning this the way you learn a new dialect, one word at a time, each word slightly more alarming than the last. I sat for a moment with that sentence. I was at that time not yet in the habit of keeping notes, not yet in the habit of counting. The small leather notebook I had carried since my first year in New York, dark brown, pocket-sized, the one I kept for property addresses and commission rates, and the names of clients I wanted to remember, was upstairs in my coat pocket. I had not yet started using it for Eleanor. I said all right. I said we could talk about it another time. He put down the tablet and kissed my forehead on his way to the study. His voice was warm when he said good night. He meant it. He always meant it. That was year 1. I stood in my own hallway and listened to my mother-in-law make soup in my kitchen, with a key my husband had given her without asking. I told myself it was an adjustment. I told myself every family was different. I told myself much in year 1. I had not yet started counting. I would. Christmas at the Hartley house fell on a Thursday that year, and the house on Birchwood Lane had the particular smell of Douglas fir and mulled cider, and something floral underneath it, Eleanor's fragrance, the one she wore for occasions she had organized. The tree was 8 feet, decorated in gold and white. The table was set for 9. The tablecloth had not a single crease. From the kitchen, something on the stove let out a low hiss and went quiet. Eleanor Hartley was never loud. She had what I can only describe as a consistent indoor temperature, warm enough to be read as kind, cool enough that nothing she said was ever technically provable as cruelty. She welcomed me at the door with a hug and a remark about how well I looked, and she called me dear, as she always did, as though my name were a minor detail she could not quite retrieve. She led me in with a hand at my back. She ran every room she entered without raising her voice once. Charles Hartley, Robert's father, was 70, semi-retired, a man with fair skin gone ruddy at the cheeks, and the comfortable manner of someone who had long ago decided that silence was a reasonable response to most situations. He shook my hand at Christmas with what I can only call benign inattention, and settled into his chair near the window. Carol Banks, Robert's sister, 38, handed me a glass of wine before I had taken off my coat. Carol was married, 2 children, and fully on Eleanor's side in every situation that involved a side. She was the kind of woman who said the right thing, and meant the wrong thing, and had such practice doing it that the distance between them was invisible to most people in the room. She gave me the package after the children opened their gifts, presented with both hands, wrapped in silver paper with a white bow. The book inside was called The Art of a Thriving Marriage, 300 pages, hardcover. On the inside cover, in blue ink in Eleanor's handwriting and Carol's handwriting below it, both of them, because we want you both to be happy. I said thank you. I said it in the register I keep for decisions already made. Carol smiled. Eleanor was watching from across the room, and when I looked up she nodded once, a small approving nod, as though the gift had done what it was sent to do. The dinner was lamb, which Eleanor had prepared, and the table was the kind of gathering that looks like warmth from a photograph and feels, from the inside, like a performance everyone knows their lines to. Between the salad and the main, Charles set down his fork and looked at me in the way men look at you when they are about to tell you something they consider a courtesy. Robert was engaged to someone much more suitable before you, he said. From Greenwich. Lovely family. I thought you should know. He picked up his fork. He went back to his steak. He said it the way he might have said the lamb was excellent. Warmly. As information, Robert did not react. Carol refilled her wine. Eleanor passed the bread. I looked at my plate for a moment. The lamb was pink at the center. The potatoes were roasted in rosemary. I cut a small piece and ate it and said nothing, because nothing was the correct response when someone says a thing like that at that temperature, as though they are letting you in on a benign piece of history. I read every page of that book over the next 3 weeks. I read it the way I read everything, which is the way I learned to read financial documents in New York. Looking for what the text says and what the text means, and whether the two matched. 3 weeks after Christmas, I planned a dinner party. 12 people. I had a list. The Walkers from down the road, the Cohens from Robert's firm, Sarah from June's book circle, the Menozas from the block. Robert mentioned over breakfast that maybe the Prestons should be included, they might feel left out. I asked where he had heard that. He said his mother had mentioned it. I asked when he had spoken to his mother. He said she had called that morning. The list changed. The Prestons came. I had not invited the Prestons. They were Eleanor's friends. The following Tuesday, my phone rang at 10 in the morning. Eleanor, her voice at its usual temperature, measured and soft. "I just wanted to check in," she said. "I saw in a message Robert showed me that you've been exhausted. I'm a little worried. You've seemed overwhelmed lately." She paused. "Are you sure you're managing all right, dear?" She was calling because she had read a text I had sent to a friend. Robert had shown it to her. She was using the word overwhelmed as though she were a nurse and I were a patient. Her voice never rose. It was 20 minutes. At the end she said she was always there if I needed to talk and she hoped I would take care of myself. When she hung up, I sat at the kitchen table and looked at the wall. The kitchen smelled of the coffee I had let go cold. The refrigerator made its small constant hum. I sat there for a while. Then I went upstairs and got the leather notebook from my coat pocket and brought it to the table. I did not write anything in it. I sat with it closed in front of me. The book was 300 pages. I read every word, not because I thought I needed it. I already knew what kind of person gives a gift like that and calls it love. I was learning something more useful, exactly how she thought. Spring of year 3 arrived the way springs arrive in Millbrook. Slowly and by degrees, the mud drying on the roads, the maples going pale green at the tips, the air carrying the faint scent of thaw. The world smelled like beginnings. I had been at June's Cafe the morning before the brunch, a Tuesday, the last of the quiet Tuesdays I would have for some time. The cafe smelled of dark roast and the cinnamon rolls June set out at 6, and the light through the front window was the thin pale light of early spring that makes everything look like it has been cleaned overnight. I sat with my coffee and my notes, 2 pages of license exam material I had been working through, and June came out from behind the counter and refilled my cup, without asking, and went back. I was at a different stage of calculation. I had been invited to brunch by Carol at a restaurant on Main Street, the kind of place with white tablecloths and weekend specials written in chalk on a board. Carol was already there when I arrived, her children with Robert's mother at home, her husband at a morning golf game. She was in a coral blazer, her fair skin bright against it. She had ordered the eggs. We were 20 minutes in when she mentioned Seattle. "It was a good offer," she said, spreading butter on her toast. "I thought for a while they might actually go, but you know how it is." I did not know how it was. I did not know what she was talking about. I asked her what offer. She looked up. Something moved across her face, some calculation, and then she took a small sip of her coffee and said, "The partnership. In Seattle. In March. Robert didn't tell you?" She said it with a practiced lightness. She did not say it as a cruelty. She said it the way she said everything, warmly, as information, exactly the way her father had spoken at the Christmas dinner table. It was a Hartley manner. They were a family of people who said damaging remarks in the same tone one uses to read a grocery list. I noted, then, that Eleanor had not anticipated this. Carol had told me something Eleanor had intended to keep invisible. It was the only time I ever saw Eleanor's management fail, and it failed because she had trusted Carol to know what not to say. She had miscalculated her daughter. She would not make that mistake again. I said I must have forgotten. I drove home in 12 minutes. The car smelled of leather and the faint must of the rubber floor mats. I watched the maples go by the window. I pulled into the drive and sat in the car for a moment with my hands on the wheel. Robert was in the kitchen when I came in. I asked him about Seattle. He said the timing wasn't right. I asked whose timing. He looked at his hands. He said he had made the decision he felt was right for the family. He said it in the way a person says something they have rehearsed. Not rehearsed badly. Just rehearsed. He did not say Eleanor's name. That night I could not sleep. I lay in the dark and listened to the sound of Robert's breathing, steady and even, while something in my sternum pressed inward and stayed there. At midnight I got up and went downstairs. I made tea. I did not drink. I opened Robert's laptop on the kitchen table, not looking for anything. I was not looking for anything. I was a woman who worked for 7 years in commercial real estate analysis in New York. A woman who reconciles numbers and looks for what does not fit. And I was sitting at a kitchen table at midnight feeling a column that did not add up. I found the email chain in a folder Robert used for reference documents. It went back to early March. 14 emails. Robert and Eleanor, subject line, Seattle timing. The dates span 3 weeks. Alternatives discussed. Hartford expansion, a local promotion possibility Eleanor had heard about from someone at her church. A final email from Eleanor, sent on a Wednesday at 8:47 in the morning. I think we both know this isn't what's right for the family. There will be other opportunities, and I need you to know how much it means to me that you would even consider staying. Robert had replied 11 minutes later. You're right, I'll decline. I read the email chain twice. I am someone who reads a document twice when I need to be sure I have understood it, and not what I expected it to say. The document said the same thing both times. I closed the laptop. The kitchen was quiet. The tap dripped once and stopped. I went to the window and looked at the backyard in the dark, the grass still pale from the cold, the maple at the fence line without its leaves yet. He had not asked me, he had asked her, and she had said no, and that had been the end of it, and he had come home that evening and spoken to me about the week and the weather and whatever was on the news, and he had not said a word. I went back to bed. I lay down. I did not say anything to Robert. But I was beginning to count the emails, the calls, the spice drawer, the guest list, the dinner table line about Greenwich, the 20-minute phone call about the text Robert had shown her, the books, the soup, the key. I was counting. I had not opened my notebook yet. I was still counting in my head. He had not asked me. He had asked her. That was the year I understood that I was not the primary relationship in my marriage. I was the secondary one. Eleanor had raised Robert alone. His father had left when Robert was 9, and Eleanor had made Robert her project and her purpose, and I understood now in the kitchen at midnight, her answer to everything she had lost. He had not chosen this. He had been built for it, one careful year at a time. That did not make it easier to live with, but it made it legible. October came with cold mornings and low light, the kind of light that falls flat and sideways through bare branches. The exam was on a Thursday, at the state licensing office 40 minutes from Millbrook, a building that smelled of carpet cleaner and industrial heating, and the particular neutrality of government offices, a smell I find clarifying. I had been studying for 6 months, not at the house. At June's cafe before it opened, June letting me in at 6:15 with her keys, and a nod and never asking what I was studying or why I was there so early. At the Millbrook Public Library on Tuesday afternoons, at a table in the back near the periodicals, in my car during Robert's firm dinners, parked in the lot of the venue with the interior light on, and my notes spread across the passenger seat. Millbrook sat 30 minutes from Hartford, close enough to the Metro North Corridor, that the West Side had always drawn buyers priced out of Fairfield County. I had watched this market for 2 years without understanding it. I was beginning to understand it. Real estate law, contract law, agency relationships, fiduciary duty, fair housing regulations, the principles of appraisal, property valuation methods I had learned adjacent to during 7 years in commercial analysis in New York, now formalized, codified, tested. I had not told anyone in the Hartley family, not Robert, not Eleanor, not Carol. I sat in the exam room at a table with 11 other people. The room had the particular quiet that has a texture, 240 questions, 12 people who were not looking at each other, the occasional soft sound of a page turned. I answered every question in 3 hours and 15 minutes. I left 22 minutes early. I waited in the lobby. The proctor came out and handed me a sheet of paper. Passing score, 75. My score, 91. I sat in the parking lot in my car with the sheet on my lap. The heater was running. Outside, October trees and the gray sky and a woman walking a dog along the fence at the edge of the lot, and it was 11:40 in the morning, and I had just become a licensed real estate agent on the first attempt. I called June. She said, "Come to the cafe. I'm making the good coffee." We sat at the small table by the front window, the one with the view of Center Street, for 2 hours. The cafe smelled of roasted beans and the cinnamon June put in everything in October. She brought 2 cups and a card in an envelope. Inside the card, in June's large, slanted handwriting, "You were always going to be the best at this. Now you have the paper that says so." I held the card for a moment. June watched the street. She had the manner of a woman who understands that some moments do not need commentary. That evening, I told Robert. He was at the kitchen table with his tablet reading. He said, "That's great." He said it in the way he received news he was not tracking. He said, "What made you want to do that?" I said I had been thinking about it for a while. He said, He turned the page. At 9:15, Eleanor called. He picked up on the second ring and walked to the study. The door was not fully closed. I could hear his voice, the tone of it, the rhythm of it, the way it lifted and turned when he spoke to her, more present than it had been in the kitchen. I could not hear the words. I put on my coat. I picked up my leather notebook from the counter where I had set it before dinner. I went out the front door and walked down Center Street, in the dark. The air was cold and smelled of wood smoke from somewhere up the hill. My boots were loud on the pavement. I walked for 40 minutes. When I came back, the study door was closed. The light was on underneath it. I took off my coat. I put the notebook back in the pocket. I went upstairs. I passed the exam on my first try alone, without telling anyone in the Hartley family. That was the only quiet victory I had that year. I kept it quiet on purpose. February is the hardest month in Millbrook. The snow compacts to gray at the road edges, the sky is the color of old bone, and the cold has been going on long enough that it no longer feels seasonal. It feels architectural, part of the architecture of it. I had switched doctors the previous autumn, a practical decision. The new practice was on Elm Street, a building with warm lighting and a waiting room that smelled of lemon and clean fabric. Dr. Paulson was 53, methodical, unhurried. I liked her immediately, the way I like people who say what they observe without ornamenting it. She reviewed my chart at my annual appointment in the 3rd week of February. She set it on her knee, and she said, in the measured way she said everything, "There are some notes in the records transferred from your previous practice. Someone flagged some concerns about emotional difficulties. Recommended follow-up." She looked at me. "I want to be transparent with you about it, because it's there and it will stay there, but I don't consider it clinically relevant. It came in as a referral note, from a community member, without a clinical basis. Not from a physician." I asked who the community member was. She said the note did not identify the source by name. I asked when it was filed. She looked at the date. She said it had been filed 14 months ago. The previous physician, Dr. Carey, had received an informal note from a community member at a charity event. Dr. Carey and Eleanor Hartley served on the board of the same hospital auxiliary. The note had been documented as a welfare concern and transferred with the chart when I switched practices. I thanked her. I scheduled my follow-up. I put on my coat in the exam room, my hands working the buttons the way they always do, steadily, one at a time. I went out to my car. I drove to June's. The cafe was between the morning rush and lunch, 4 tables occupied, the hiss of the espresso machine going somewhere in the back, the smell of coffee and the sweet faint smell of the butter pastries June made on Thursdays. I sat at our table by the window. I did not pick up a menu. June came out of the back, looked at me, and went behind the counter. She came back with 2 cups. I told her. June is not a woman who fills silence out of discomfort. She sat across from me and she was quiet for a moment, and the cafe went on around us, the low murmur of the other tables, the click of cups, the sound of a car passing on Center Street outside. Eleanor Hartley, she said. She did not say it as a question. I said I did not have proof. June said, "You don't need proof to know." She was right. I knew. I had been counting for 8 months. I had the emails, the guest list, the key, the phone calls, the books, and now a note in my medical chart, placed there by a woman who had told a doctor at a fundraiser that her daughter-in-law seemed fragile. Eleanor Hartley's voice never rose. Her cruelty was always wrapped in the language of care. She told a doctor I was fragile, while smiling at me across the Christmas table and passing me the bread. I drove home. The sky was the same color it had been in the morning. I went inside and took off my coat and got the leather notebook from the pocket. I sat at the kitchen table. I opened it to a clean page. In the column I used for notes I wrote one line. Filed notes in my medical chart. I closed the notebook. I put it on the counter. I went to the bread drawer and took out flour and yeast and the small clay bowl I used for proofing, and I made bread. My hands knew what to do. The dough under my palms was cool and then warm, and the kitchen filled with the smell of yeast and flour, and I worked the dough for 10 minutes without thinking about anything except the dough. My hands are always steady. That is the one thing I have never lost, through any of it. My hands know what to do even when my mind is still catching up. I had the chart note now. What I did not have yet was her voice. The sale on Ashford Lane closed on a Thursday in October, 14 months after I joined Whitmore Realty. The house was a colonial, 4 bedrooms, 2.5 baths, a kitchen with original wide plank floors, and a south-facing window that made the room golden in the afternoon. I had the listing for 11 weeks. I ran 42 showings. I held 2 open houses. I negotiated 3 rounds on the final offer. The sale price was $2,800,000. Marcus Webb had been the first person to shake my hand when I walked into Whitmore Realty 14 months before. He was 45, the senior agent, with fair skin and close-cropped dark hair going silver at the temples, and the kind of unhurried precision that people develop when they have been reading markets for a long time and have learned not to mistake speed for accuracy. He had done the handshake the way you shake a hand when you are already forming an assessment. He said, "I've heard of you. June Callahan's friend." I said that was right. He said, "She doesn't have many. That's something." He showed me my desk. In the months between April and October I had closed 4 listings. The Ashford Lane Colonial was the 5th. I had worked every one of them the same way I had worked financial analysis in New York. Methodically, from the data out, pricing each property with the rigor I would have brought to a commercial valuation report. I priced correctly. I negotiated without theater. I was never the loudest person in a room, and I was consistently the most prepared. The Millbrook Courier ran its real estate section on Saturdays. The following Saturday morning, page 8, a photograph of 22 Ashford Lane with the sold sign in the front yard, and below it, in 8-point type, the listing summary. Listing agent, Diane Caldwell, Whitmore Realty. My name in a Millbrook paper. My name above a number that represented the largest residential sale in the town's west side that year. I was 14 months into my license. Marcus had told me the previous week that I had closed more transaction volume in my first year than any agent Whitmore had brought on in the previous decade. He said it as a professional observation. He did not say it to encourage me. He said it because it was a fact and he dealt in facts. Robert saw it. He said nothing at breakfast. Eleanor called at 10:15 that morning, while he and I were both in the kitchen, and I heard his half of the call while I washed the dishes. He said, "I know." "Yes," he said. "I'll mention it to her." He came into the kitchen when the call was done. He said, "Mom says congratulations." He went back to the living room. I dried my hands on the dish towel. I folded it over the oven handle. I looked at the window over the sink, at the backyard in October, the maple dropping its leaves. The following Tuesday, Marcus took me to lunch at the restaurant on Hartford Avenue, the one with the deep booths and the old wood smell, the kind of place where people discuss serious matters, without being overheard. He ate his soup. The restaurant was quiet at that hour, the particular quiet between its services, a sound of running water somewhere in the kitchen, and nothing else. He told me I had the best instinct for pricing he had seen in 12 years in that market. He said it without preamble, as a professional assessment. He said he had a listing coming in the first quarter, a property on the west side, and he wanted me to second chair it. I took the leather notebook from my coat pocket and wrote, Q1 listing, west side, second chair with M&W. I wrote the date. I closed the notebook. I said, "Thank you, I would be there." The ad was 3 inches wide. My name was an 8-point type. I have had it in my wallet since the day it ran. There are things you don't go looking for. That November, one of them found me first. It was a Sunday in November, the kind of Sunday that smells of cold radiator heat and the particular stillness of a house, where nothing is scheduled. I was in the kitchen in the early afternoon, the remains of lunch on the counter, the sound of the shower running upstairs. Robert's phone was on the counter beside the coffee maker, face up, unlocked. He had set it down when he went up. The screen was lit, open to the voice memos app. The list of memos was visible. The most recent one was at the top. The label read, "For our thoughts on the conversation." The timestamp showed it had been added 11 days ago. The length showed beneath it, 18:42. I stood at the counter and looked at the phone. I had not planned to look. The phone was there and the screen was lit and the memo had a label and I stood there for what I estimate was 30 seconds. Then I sat down at the kitchen table and I pressed play. Something behind my sternum went still, the way it goes still when you recognize a voice you were not prepared to hear at that volume. Eleanor's voice came out of the phone speaker at the volume of a woman speaking to someone across a kitchen table, unhurried, measured, at the indoor temperature she maintained for all occasions. The thing you have to understand is that Diane is not happy here. That's not your fault. Some people aren't suited for the life they choose. She was nobody before she came here. She is nobody now. This was never going to be enough for her. A small pause. When she brings up the key, the right thing to say is that you trust your mother, and she should respect that. Don't apologize. When she brings up Seattle, you can say you made the decision you felt was right for the family. Don't say I was involved. When she asks you why you didn't tell her, say you were protecting her from the stress. She responds well to being protected. Another pause. And if she keeps pushing, I really do think it's time for her to speak to someone professionally. I'll reach out to Dr. Paulson, if you think. I stopped the recording. I set the phone down on the table with both hands. I did not pick it up again. I went to the window. Outside, Center Street was going about its Sunday. A car. Someone's dog on a leash. The maple at the edge of the lot had lost every leaf. The branches made a pattern against the white sky that was clean and simple, the kind of image that stays in you. The shower was still running upstairs. Robert was still up there. The house was otherwise silent, the refrigerator hum, the faint tick of the hall clock. I did not reach for my notebook. My notebook was in my coat by the door. I did not go to it. I stood at the window and I let what I had heard arrange itself into the shape it was. Eleanor knew what our arguments were about because Robert called her after each one. She had listened. She had prepared a document. She had told him what I was not suited for, what to say and not say, and what the goal of any conversation with me should be. She had listened to my marriage from the outside and coached it like a project she was managing. Robert had saved the memo. He had listened to it more than once. I could see the play count in the memo header. She had said she would reach out to Dr. Paulson. That note had already been sitting in my chart for nearly 2 years, passed from one practice to the next without my name on the request, filed before I had even thought to switch doctors. This memo was 11 days old. She was still doing it. I heard the shower stop. I heard the pipes settle. I heard Robert's footsteps overhead. I picked up my phone from the counter and I called June. I said almost nothing. June listened. She said, "Do you want to come over?" I said no. I had a showing at 2. I said I would talk to her in the morning. I went to the showing at 2. The property was a 3-bedroom on Mill Road, a family relocating from Hartford. I walked them through every room. I answered every question. I discussed the school district and the commute and the comps in the area. I closed the consultation in 40 minutes. The husband shook my hand. The wife said they would be in touch. I sat in my car in the driveway of the Mill Road property and called my attorney from the contact list I had added to my phone 3 months earlier. The attorney's name was Patricia Moss, and she had an office on Hartford Avenue 2 blocks from the Whitmore office. I had not called her before. I called her now. She answered on the 3rd ring. I filed for divorce the following Thursday. I want to be precise about what the memo was. It was not a revelation. I had the key. I had the emails. I had the chart note. I had been counting for over a year and the count was already complete. What the memo was confirmation. It made the pattern audible in Eleanor's own voice, in her own words, at her own indoor temperature. That is what I had not had before. Not the knowledge, the proof that was past arguing with. 18 minutes and 42 seconds. I have never listened to it again. I did not need to. I understood everything I needed to understand in the first 4 minutes, and I spent the remaining 14 confirming what I already knew. The courthouse was on the main street in Millbrook, a granite-faced building with steps worn shallow at the center from 100 years of traffic. I arrived before 8. Patricia Moss was already in the lobby with her briefcase across her knees. The building smelled of radiator heat and old paper. Outside, February had compacted the snow to gray at the road edges. The divorce proceedings were 3 months, which is a short amount of time when you consider what they contain. I will compress them the way they compressed themselves. Paperwork, attorneys, a negotiation conducted through those attorneys, and one morning at the Millbrook County Courthouse that I want to describe to you. Eleanor was there. She was in dark navy, her hair set, pearls at her throat. She sat in the gallery on Robert's side, and I watched her from across the aisle while Patricia Moss set our documents on the table, and Eleanor had a tissue that she brought to the corner of her eye twice in the first 10 minutes, in a way that was angled toward the room. Not toward Robert. Toward the room. Robert's attorney was a man from Hartford named Greer. Patricia sat beside me, and she was the steadiest person in the building. The agreement we had negotiated was fair. I kept my savings account, my car, my license, my notebook. I did not fight for the house. The house smelled of Eleanor and chicken broth and reorganized spice drawers, and I did not want it. We signed. The judge spoke. I thanked Patricia and we walked out into a February morning that was cold and flat, and smelled of car exhaust, and old snow compacted at the road edges. I want to tell you something true about that morning. I had not expected to feel what I felt standing in the February cold outside the courthouse. I had been counting for over a year. I had been certain. And I was still certain. But I was going to miss him. Not the Robert who had given Eleanor a key and shared my texts and declined Seattle without telling me. The one who had kissed my forehead and meant it. That version of him had existed. It was not the version I was married to, but it had existed, and I was going to miss it. I allowed myself 30 seconds for that, and then I walked to my car. On a Wednesday morning in March, I stood at the DMV on Route 9 and signed a form with my maiden name, Diane Caldwell. The clerk processed it without looking up. I was Diane Caldwell again. It took 4 minutes. I moved into a 2-bedroom apartment on Millbrook's east side that Saturday. It came furnished, which meant it was temporary looking and faintly impersonal, the way furnished rentals are, and I unpacked in one afternoon. 4 boxes, my clothes, my books, my kitchen essentials, and my files. June brought dinner at 6, a container of her soup and a loaf of bread from the bakery on Center Street. I sat on the floor of the new apartment with my back against the couch and ate out of the container. The apartment smelled of clean paint and old radiator heat. It was mine. Robert's new relationship began 3 weeks after the filing. Eleanor had introduced them. June mentioned it to me once, in passing, over coffee at the table by the window, the way she mentioned what she wanted me to know and did not want to make larger than it was. I listened. I did not comment. The relationship lasted 4 months. I heard afterward, through June, that Charles Hartley's health had been difficult since the winter. He and Eleanor were in the house on Ashford Drive. It was a large house. I did not think about it. I closed 3 listings in the 8 months after the divorce. I was at Whitmore Realty every day. Marcus nominated me for junior partner in the spring, and I accepted in the same conversation, without asking for time to think about it. I was already past thinking about it. I began studying for my broker's license at the kitchen table in the furnished apartment, the same table where I had eaten June's soup on the floor the night I moved in. Now clear-surfaced and covered in licensing documents and highlighted statutes and the running notes, I kept in a series of legal pads organized by subject. The broker's license exam was administered on a Saturday in November, 8 hours long, at the same testing center where I had taken the sales license 2 years before. It smelled the same, carpet cleaner and industrial heat. I arrived at 7:45. I sat in the same kind of chair. That morning, before I left the apartment, I had found a card in my mailbox. Eleanor's handwriting on the envelope. My new address, which I had not given her. She had asked Robert. He had given it to her. Inside, a wreath, a candle, a winter scene, signed in Eleanor's hand, "Wishing you peace, dear. Warmly, Eleanor." She had found my address. She had sent a card. Her voice at its usual temperature, even on paper. I set it on the counter. I picked up my bag and my notebook and my keys, and I drove to the testing center. I finished the exam at 4:15 in the afternoon. I sat in the parking lot with the results sheet on my passenger seat. Passing score, 75. My score, 89. 3 years after the divorce, Caldwell Realty occupied the ground floor of a 2-story building on Center Street, 2 doors from June's Cafe. The space had been a stationery shop before I took it. I signed the lease in January. I had the name painted on the glass door in gold letters in February. By March I had 3 active listings. The office smelled of new paint and old wood floors and the coffee. I kept going on the small machine on the credenza. And from the front window, I could see June's green door, and the maple on the corner that had been losing and regrowing its leaves for the 3 years I had been counting in this town. Marcus Webb called on a Tuesday morning in the 3rd week of March. He called my office line. When I answered, he said, "I have a referral for you. The Hartley family home, 14 Ashford Drive." I held the phone. He said, "Robert Hartley called us about it first. Eleanor's handling the listing. I don't have capacity." A pause. "She tried 2 other firms after. Neither had capacity on the west side. I thought of you. If it's too complicated, I understand." I said it was not too complicated. I took the leather notebook from my desk drawer and I wrote, 14 Ashford Drive. I wrote the date. Below the address I wrote, Hartley listing. I closed the notebook. Eleanor arrived on Thursday at 11. I heard the door of the building and then her step in the corridor, unhurried and measured, and she came into my office in a gray wool coat, her hair set, no hat. She wore the pearl earrings, the small ones that do not move when you turn your head. She carried a small purse. She sat down in the chair across from my desk and she looked at the room. She looked at the framed photograph on the wall behind me, the Ashford Lane sale, the colonial with the sold sign, my name in the caption. She looked at the broker's license frame beside it. She looked at the nameplate on my desk, polished silver letters, Diane Caldwell. She did not say anything about the nameplate. She looked at me. She said, "I appreciate you seeing me." Her voice at its usual temperature. I went through the listing packet, the market analysis for Ashford Drive, the comparable sales, 6 properties within half a mile, 3 sold in the last year, the pricing recommendation, 1.2 million, a number grounded in the data, and price to move in 30 to 45 days. The commission structure, the marketing plan. My voice was level and specific. My hands were flat on the desk. I said everything that needed to be said, and nothing that did not. Eleanor asked 2 questions, one about the timeline, one about what would happen if the first offer came in below asking. I answered both questions with the answers the data supported. Then I slid the listing agreement across the desk, 3 pages. At the bottom of the 3rd page, the signature line read, "Listing broker Diane Caldwell, Caldwell Realty." Eleanor looked at the pages. She looked at them for what I estimate was 20 seconds, which is a long time to look at something you are about to sign. Something moved in her face, something slight and quick, the way a current moves through water without breaking the surface. She picked up the pen from the desk, a Whitmore Realty pen, blue, the kind Marcus kept in a cup by the reception desk. She had been to Whitmore first. She had carried it here. She signed. I took the document. I signed my own name on the broker line, below hers. I paper-clipped the pages and set them in the new client folder I had prepared that morning with her name on the tab. She stood. She gathered her coat. She said, "I will trust your judgment on the pricing." She said it the way she said everything, warmly, as though it were a gift she was giving me. I walked her to the door of the office. Outside on Center Street, I saw that Robert's car was parked in front of June's cafe, a dark sedan, engine off. It had been there since before Eleanor arrived. He had not come in. Eleanor crossed Center Street. When she reached Robert's car, she stopped at the passenger window and he lowered it. She said something. He nodded. She got in. The car pulled away from the curb and moved down Center Street and turned at the light. I went back inside. My phone buzzed at 12:40 with a text from June. I saw them leave. I typed back one word, "Yes." I sat at my desk. I opened the new client folder and took out the listing agreement and began the comp analysis. The office was quiet except for the coffee machine on the credenza and the sound of traffic on Center Street below the window. She signed the papers with a Whitmore Realty pen she had carried from the Whitmore lobby. My name was on the signature line. She left without saying anything about the office. I took that as a review. The Tuesday was the 14th of September, a morning that smelled of early fall. The cold not yet settled in but present in the air before 8, the light coming at the low angle that means summer is gone. Caldwell Realty had been open 8 months. My mother, Linda Caldwell, had flown in from Columbus the day before. She was 67 years old, a retired nurse from Ohio, fair-skinned, with gray hair she kept short and a manner I have spent my entire life depending on, plain-spoken and perceptive and never, in my memory, wrong about a person on the first meeting. She had met Eleanor Hartley exactly once, at the rehearsal dinner the night before my wedding to Robert. She had found me afterward in the hallway and said, "That woman is not going to stop." I had said I was sure it would work out. She had said, "I hope so." She had not said "I told you so," not once in all the years since. That is the kind of person my mother is. She was staying at the inn on Main Street, the one that used to be the Hartley family's preferred place before the divorce. Linda had called ahead and booked it herself without mentioning this to me, until she was already checked in. She told me that evening at dinner with the specific matter-of-factness of a woman who acts on purpose and sees no need to explain her purposes. Tuesday morning at 9, I met her on the sidewalk in front of the office. The gold letters on the glass door caught the early light. Caldwell Realty, my name. The same name as hers, my grandmother's name, a name that belonged to women who built and did not apologize for it. Linda stood on the sidewalk in her good coat, the charcoal one, and she looked at the sign for a long time. She did not say anything. A car went by on Center Street. Somewhere down the block a door opened and closed. The air smelled of coffee from June's Cafe 2 doors down. Then she said, "Your grandmother would have gotten a kick out of this." I said, "She would have negotiated the lease." Linda said, "She would have owned the building." We went inside. As of that Tuesday in September, the Hartley home at 14 Ashford Drive had sold in 31 days at $1,447,000, $247,000 over the asking price, in a market where over-asking sales above $100,000 were uncommon. Diane Caldwell's commission had closed on a Friday in April. I did not celebrate. I worked the following Monday. Marcus had referred me 2 more listings on the west side since then, both sold, one with a record price for its street. Robert's relationship had ended in February, as June had said it would. June mentioned it once, briefly, over coffee, in the same factual tone she used for everything she wanted me to know without making more of. I listened. I did not comment. I had not spoken to Robert since the paperwork from the Ashford Drive sale had been signed and transmitted to his attorney. Linda walked through the office. She looked at the framed ad from the Millbrook Courier, the 3-inch wide clipping with my name in 8-point type, the one I had taken out of my wallet and had framed when I signed the lease. She looked at the broker's license. She looked at the desk, the leather notebook on the corner of it, the comp analysis I was working, the new client folders in the tray. She did not say anything about any of it. She sat down in the chair across from my desk and put her hands in her lap and looked at me. That evening we had dinner at June's Cafe, the 3 of us, at the table by the window. The cafe smelled of coffee and the autumn soup June made every September, roasted butternut with pepper, warm and full. The light through the window was the last of the evening light, fading orange at the horizon, and Center Street outside was emptying of its Tuesday traffic. At some point Linda set down her spoon and she looked at me and she asked, in the way she had asked me questions my entire life, not performing concern but exercising it, "Are you all right?" Not how are you, whether I was all right. The distinction matters to me because she always made it. I thought about the question. I thought about the email chain I had read at midnight in year 3, the memo I had listened to on a Sunday afternoon, the note in my chart, the key, the soup, the books, the Christmas dinner and Charles's warm voice and the line about Greenwich. The 6 months of studying in a closed cave before the town was awake, the exam in October and June's card and the 8-point type in the Millbrook Courier, the broker's exam at 4:15 in the afternoon, and the card on the counter I had not opened, the gold letters on my own glass door. I said, I am building something. That is all I know how to say right now. Linda nodded. She picked up her spoon. She said, that's enough. That's always been enough. June brought the check and set it face down on the table, and held up one hand when Linda reached for her purse. She shook her head. She went back behind the counter. Linda and I sat for a few minutes more in the warm cafe smell and the last of the evening light. I walked home alone. Center Street at 9, the cafe lights behind me, the air carrying the first real cold of the season, the kind of cold that settles in and stays. I passed the office. The gold letters were lit by the street lamp, Caldwell Realty. I looked at them for a moment. I did not stop. I had an early showing tomorrow, a 2-bedroom on the east side, the first unit in a new development, a client relocating from Providence. I went home. I put on the kettle. I sat at the kitchen table and took out my notebook and opened it to a new page. I wrote the address at the top, below it the asking price, below that I wrote, comp analysis needed. I started. Diane Caldwell earned a real estate license alone, in a closed cafe, before the town was awake. She earned a broker's license while Eleanor was sending cards to her new address. She opened a brokerage on Center Street, 2 doors down from the only person in Millbrook who ever handed her a coffee without asking. Eleanor walked in with a Whitmore Realty pen she had carried from their lobby. She signed her name under Diane's. Then she went back to the car where Robert was waiting. That is where I will leave them. Before you go, tell me in the comments, where in the world are you listening today? I read every single one. And if you have ever smiled and said it's fine, when it was absolutely not fine, drop a comment. Tell me you were here. This story was for you. If Diane's story is one someone in your life needs, please share it. You never know who is sitting in a closed cafe at 6 in the morning, counting. I will see you in the next one. 3 years ago I filed for divorce with a real estate license I had earned in secret, and a leather notebook with 4 addresses in it. Eleanor Hartley called me nobody from nowhere. What I know, at 39, is this: the women who are called nobody are the ones who build something while the people calling them that are still standing in the same room. I am not standing in that room anymore. I have a brokerage. I have a broker's license and a client list and a lease and a nameplate. My name is on the door of a building I chose and signed for and opened. I put it there myself. That is not a room for living in. That is a room for working in, and it is mine, and no one gave it to me.